Good evening, class. Last class period we were just getting into nationalism, so I'm just going to review what we went over in class real quick and then finish up our discussion of nationalism and then get into imperialism. Now, last class period we talked about how nationalism is set apart from, first, the divine right of rulers. This is what justified king's rule, that the kings received their authority from God and thus had the right to rule. Now, coming out of the Enlightenment, as we talked about, there's another political philosophy called cosmopolitanism. Cosmopolitanism is the belief that since everybody has power, everybody has their own personal rights, that human beings are sort of what you might call citizens of the world, that there are no national boundaries, there are no political boundaries. Nationalism stands in between these two. Nationalism justifies national boundaries or political boundaries, but not based on the right of the rulers. Instead, nationalism refers to, well, we, and the we is people of a similar ethnic, national, or racial group that share a common culture, such as religion, language, similar history, food. I mean, it can be all of these things. If you share a same background, you have the right, and you have the duty to be with people like yourself. That everybody of a similar culture and background has the right to be in an independent and autonomous political community, a state, and thus the nation state. And thus nationalism evolves, starting in the 1700s, and picking up steam during the Age of Revolution, but really fully expressing itself in the mid to late 1800s. And we talked about how England was an early sort of prototype nation state, starting with Henry VIII's separation of the Anglican Church away from the Catholic Church in the mid-1500s, going all the way through Queen Elizabeth and the combination of Britannia. We talked about the influences of the Napoleonic era. We talked about the unification of Italy, for example. And we were just getting into the unification of Germany. So let's talk about Germany. I can't remember how far we got into this, but let's kind of just start from the beginning here. Germany, before the French Revolution, was still part of what was known as the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire was basically an antiquated holdover from the medieval period. It wasn't a state. It wasn't a real empire, and it wasn't Roman. What it was a collection of German states, small German states, that had their own princes, and these princes had authority within their principalities. Now, the princes would elect a Holy Roman Emperor, and the Holy Roman Emperor theoretically had leadership throughout the Holy Roman Empire. However, the power of the Holy Roman Emperor was dependent on how much support he got from the princes. Now, when Napoleon invades the Holy Roman Empire in the early 1800s, the Holy Roman Empire just simply collapses. It just dissolves. And so Napoleon is able to pick away and pull away German states and basically force them to side with him or defeat them piecemeal like he does with Prussia and Austria. Now, after the Napoleonic Wars, the Holy Roman Empire will not reconstruct itself. Instead, this collection of weak German states will be left in the center of Europe. Now, the two most powerful of these German states, Prussia and the Austrian Empire, will grow during this time. They'll grow in the early to mid 1800s and actually vie with each other for who will have the most influence over their German neighbors. Now, beginning in the mid-1800s, Prussia will start to eclipse Austria. Part of this is because of the rise of Otto von Bismarck. Otto von Bismarck, and if you're wanting to know a little bit more about Otto von Bismarck, your textbook has a good discussion about him on page 678 and 679. He comes to power in the mid-1800s, around 1850. Now, he is the Chancellor of Prussia. That means that he is the nominal head of their parliament. It doesn't mean that he's the king. The king that Otto von Bismarck serves is King Wilhelm I. Now, Bismarck is a nationalist. And he's a nationalist not because he just wants all the Germans to live together. Bismarck recognizes the power of French nationalism. He recognizes that the only way for Prussia to be powerful, to be a state to be reckoned with, is to have control over all the German principalities. The problem for Bismarck is that Prussia is sort of politically fighting with Austria on who's going to have influence over these various German states. Prussia, of course, has nominal influence here, but so does Austria here. Bismarck wants all of this, and he doesn't want Austria as part of the deal. He wants Prussia to be the dominant member of a new German state. So, in the 1850s, let me see if your book actually talks about this. No, it doesn't. In the 1850s, Prussia will fight, or I should, not the 1850s, the 1860s, sorry. Not the 1850s, the 1860s. In the 1860s, Prussia will fight a war that your book calls the Danish War. It's sometimes called the Austro-Prussian War as well. This war is between Austria and Prussia over who is going to control this, get my mouse working here, over who's going to control this area of Germany, or what will become Germany, because both Prussia and Austria have claims to this territory. Prussia claims influence over, let's see here, does it, I can't remember, I keep, let's see here. Over who controls Schleswig and Holstein. And so what Bismarck is going to do, he's going to pick a fight. He's going to pick a fight with the Austrians. However, Bismarck does not want Prussia to appear to be the aggressor. Not only will this bode ill for Prussia in international affairs, because the Austrians can garner support from abroad, he wants to rally not only the Prussian people, but the other German peoples to to Prussia's side. And it looks better if you're trying to get people to be on your side if you can claim that you're fighting a war of defense. So he maneuvers the Austrians into firing the first shot. Now this idea of not only taking military action, but also using politics as well as what you might call propaganda, is what becomes known as realpolitik. Bismarck will get what he wants, whether it be through negotiation or war, but he's always keeping in mind the long-term goals of German unification around Prussia. And he does not want any unintended consequences. So, he's going to basically play both sides against the middle. Now, the Austrians, well, to put it bluntly, they're not ready to fight the Prussians. The Prussians have a better organized military, they have a better industrial base, and Prussia wins this war that's fought in the mid-1860s. I think your book says that it starts out in 1864. This means that Austria is going to be pushed out. It's going to be isolated and insulated from what's going on here in Germany. And what this allows is for Germany, or not Germany, Prussia, to form an alliance, an economic alliance, not a political or military one yet, but an economic alliance with many of these German principalities right here. This becomes known as the North German Confederation. Now, this North German Confederation is an economic alliance. This means that Prussia and all of these other German states right here are going to trade with each other without trade barriers. They're going to give each other preferential treatment. And of course, Prussia, being the largest of these states, is going to have a greater say in this North German Confederation. Now, this brings attention to this alliance. It brings the attention of the French. Now, the French, you know, they've just gotten beaten in the Napoleonic Wars in 1814. And so the French would like to keep this area of Europe divided and weak, because right now the French have control over Lorraine and Alsace. These are areas that are mixed, sort of ethnically mixed between German and French speakers. But they also would like to have influence over these westernmost parts of the German principalities, like Cologne and down here in Bavaria. They don't want them making economic alliances with Prussia over here. So what the French are going to do is they're going to resist. Bismarck, again, turning to his policy of realpolitik, is going to try and pull the German states, not just the ones that are closest to Prussia, but the ones over here, into the orbit of Prussia by picking a fight where the French seem to be the apparent aggressors. This is the Franco-Prussian War of the mid-1870s. And it only lasts 1 or 2 years. It lasts between, let's see when your book has it lasting right here. Let's see here, 1870 to 1871, according to your book. And what happens is in 1871, the Prussians, coming to the aid of these westernmost German states, is not only going to march troops in to secure their borders, but also march them into France. They're going to march into France. They're going to surround and capture Paris. And in a most humiliating move for the French, they're going to announce the formation of the first, or not the first, but the Second Reich. The First Reich being the Kingdom of Charlemagne, the Second Reich being the new modern Germany. And so in 1871, Germany is formed. Now, what's the role of nationalism? Because this sounds like just pure politics. Well, Bismarck uses the idea of German unity and national unity to help pull these other German states into first an economic alliance, and then to use the threat of an outside foreign power, namely the French, to bring them even closer and make them want to join this new Germany. Because Germany is not going to be a country formed among equals. It's going to be a country that coalesces around a core, and the core is Prussia. Now, Prussia is, to put it bluntly, Prussia is kind of a militaristic country, or kingdom. And so the Germany that is formed out of this is going to be hyper-expansionist and militaristic. It's going to have the same traits as the core that it coalesces around. Now, here is the interesting thing about nationalism, because nationalism can be used to form a nation, but also the formation of a nation can dictate what nationalism is. In a lot of ways, nationalism is kind of a chicken and the egg argument. Does nationalism create the state, or does the creation of the state create the nationalism? And historians and sociologists and people like that are still debating this today. What we do know is that once Germany forms in the 1870s, Bismarck is going to define German nationalism. One of the creations of Bismarck after Germany forms, and he becomes the new chancellor of a Germany, not just a Prussia, is he's going to institute reforms that will Prussianify this new Germany. And one of the big ones that the United States will actually mimic is public schools. Under Bismarck, Germany will revolutionize the educational system of the West by having the first centralized and standardized public school system. And you might be going, well, how does a centralized and standardized public school system create nationalism? Well, for nationalism to exist, you need to have a common identity. How do we get a common identity? Well, having a common heritage, a common story, a common history. So the teaching of history in this new Germany is from a Prussian point of view. The teaching of politics and government is from a Prussian point of view. The teaching of what's going on outside of Germany is from a Prussian point of view. So what Bismarck is trying to do is not create a new German from the adults, but create a new German from the children. Now, it's not just people in Europe that are fighting over national identity. Our nation has to fight during the same period over who America is going to be, what America is going to be. So, first we have to look at America's unique form of nationalism, because Americans are not ethnically the same. We have different religions. We come from different places, even as early as the 1860s. So, during the American Revolution and the early Republic period, how did American leaders and opinion makers define nationalism or American identity? They defined American identity based upon the ideals of the Republic, the ideals of the Revolution, the ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, that sounds all well and good, but as the country grew up between 1800 and the 1850s, the idea of what America was supposed to be would start to differ. And it would differ mainly upon what part of the country you came from, whether you came from someplace like New York or Massachusetts, or whether you came from someplace like Georgia or Alabama. Because by the 1850s, America was two nations, two cultures, in one country. And so what you have is you have in the North an industrializing, mainly white culture that's based on initiative, on people's ability to freely get work. In the South, you have mainly an agricultural society, a society that is hierarchical, with the planters at the top, the non-property holding whites in the middle, and then of course the slaves at the bottom. This society, especially in the Deep South, is not incredibly fluid. People can't move up the ranks easily. Now, when you combine these two different cultures with the fact that by the 1850s, American leaders and American opinion makers were in complete disagreement on the role of the national government versus the state government, you have a major problem brewing. And of course, this is the American Civil War, or the War of Southern Secession, or whatever you want to call it. It was a war over what role is the government and what culture is going to be dominant. And of course, the United States goes through the Civil War between 1861 and 1865. The South loses, the North wins. This means that industry, it means that industry and and manufacturing and commerce are going to supersede agriculture and the culture of the South. It means that the South is going to be a subordinate, almost colony of the North from the Reconstruction era all the way up to the World War II era. The other thing that it means is that the national government is going to be supreme over the state governments. Because before the American Civil War, the states had clear authority and many times could supersede the authority of the national government, the federal government, when it came to state matters. After the Civil War, no one's going to question the right of the national government to really get involved, because the Civil War basically is fought over, not just slavery, but over the role of the federal government. Now, it's not just Europeans and Americans who are struggling to define what nationalism is and what a nation state is. In Eastern Europe, nationalism is going to have the opposite effect on those empires and governments. While nationalism is helping the Italians and the Germans to define their new nation states, while nationalism is going to help bring Americans together, even if it involves violence, nationalism is not welcome in the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Russian Empire. In Austro-Hungarian, if we go back here, this is Austro-Hungary right here. Now, this map right here does not show the various ethnicities within the Austrian Empire. But by the mid to late 1800s, these areas right here are going to break away from the Ottoman Empire, and some of them are going to become part of the Austrian Empire. This is a multi-ethnic empire. Only 30% of the subjects of the Austrian Empire, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, only 30% is Austrian. You might be wondering why I switch between Austrian Empire and Austro-Hungarian Empire. That's because about another 30% of the Austrian Empire is comprised of Magyars or Hungarians. And so what happens is, in order to keep the empire stable, the central government in Vienna has to make a compromise with the other large ethnicity, other national group, if you will, within the Austrian Empire. They grant the Hungarians, the Magyars, their own government so that they can come up with independent domestic policies. However, they have to defer to Vienna for all foreign policy decisions. Now, 30 and 30, that still leaves 40% of the population. Who are the other 40%? Well, the other 40% is made up of Serbians, Croats, Romanians, Muslims, Albanians, and various other small ethnic groups like Montenegrins. Do they get the same consideration from the central government? No. They have no say. Their national identity is actively suppressed by the Austrian authorities. Likewise, Russia, again, let's go back here. If we look at Russia here, the Russian Empire. By the 1800s, the Russian Empire has expanded west. They have taken over the easternmost portions of the Kingdom of Poland. They've moved into the area here in the Crimea. They've taken over Ukraine and the Crimea, where all of this, this fear of war breaking out is over. They've moved into this area right in here. And, they also control the Baltic states up here. So in the Russian Empire, only about 60% of the Russian subjects are Russians by ethnicity. The others are Poles, Ukrainians, Kazakhs, Uzbeks, Latvians, Lithuanians, Estonians. They're even Finnish, because Finland is not an independent country at this time. So nationalism is definitely not welcome by the Russians. So what's the response of the Russian czars? Well, the Russian czars try to Russify minorities. They outlaw the speaking or use of minority languages. You use Russian. They outlaw certain customs. You're going to use Russian customs. In order to enforce this, they centralize state control. They take away control from local governments, from local elites. And they also follow an expansionistic foreign policy. Again, like kind of like Bismarck in Germany did, in order to get the people to rally to Prussia. In Bismarck's case, he wanted the Germans to rally to Prussia. He was picking fights and making people like France, not people, but countries like France, look like invaders. Well, Russia's going to do the same thing. They're going to start wars on their borders with the hope of these sort of unifying the people and rallying behind the flag of Russia. Now, it's not just Europeans. Nationalism is also a characteristic of some Asian countries. To understand how nationalism affects Asia, I'm going to concentrate on Japan, because Japan is a classic example of how nationalism affects Asiatic countries. Now, the Japanese are an interesting culture, because in the 1600s, Japan, the Japanese elites, they looked with horror at what was going on in places like India and just across the narrow straits of Tsushima at what was going on in China. They saw the effect of the penetration of European powers economically and culturally into these Asiatic countries. They saw how it disrupted these traditional societies. Like, for example, Christianity. Christianity, of course, says that God is all-powerful and Jesus is his son. Well, this doesn't fit well with the Japanese worldview, because in the Japanese worldview, the emperor is the child of the sun god. And so, if you have Japanese subjects converting to Christianity, that tie to their emperor, that loyalty and sense of connection is broken if they're Christians. So what is the Japanese answer? Well, the Japanese shoguns, the military dictators, wall Japan off. Literally. They pass a series of laws stating that ocean-going ships are banned. Fishermen are not allowed to sail outside of Japanese home waters. They have to register their ships. And if they come back home after going out on the ocean in a different ship than they left with, that's why they want the ships registered, then the Japanese authorities know that they've been someplace else. And if they know they've been someplace else, they're culturally contaminated. And so they are put to death summarily. If Western sailors are shipwrecked and wash up on the coast of Japan, if they are caught by the military class of Japanese society, the samurai, they will be summarily executed. Now, this lasts up till the 1850s. In a series of visits in the 1850s and early 1860s, the American naval commander, Commodore Matthew Perry, will be sent by the American President Millard Fillmore and James Buchanan to open Japan. Now, Perry arrives at what was then called Edo Harbor. Today it's Tokyo Bay. He'll sail into Edo Bay against the wind and against the tide. His ships are steam-powered, and the cannon that they mount are quite a bit larger than the medieval type cannon that the Japanese have, because in walling themselves off, the Japanese have literally stuck their culture in a time capsule. Japan in the 1850s is no different than what it was in the 1600s. Feudalistic, primitive, no industrialization. And all of a sudden, they're introduced with modern society, or modern society as of the 1850s, 1860s. So the Japanese leaders realize that they have to make a change very, very quickly, because they're also introduced with the effects of European colonization into Asia. By the 1860s, China is a defeated power. It's defeated by the British in the 1840s. Even though the British don't take over China, China is a weak and fragmented power at this time. So the Japanese don't want that happening to them. So Japanese leaders are going to take what they want from the West, mainly technology, and combine it with certain cultural attributes of, their own culture. And what will be created out of this is a new culture, not the feudalistic Japanese culture of old. Let's not say that they take that, because in the 1870s and 1880s, the samurai class will be outlawed. They'll be hunted down, those that refuse to give up their swords. So the Japanese government is going to change Japanese society, but they're going to take certain elements, namely the idea of a warrior society, getting rid of the samurai, but making all Japanese subscribe to Bushido, or the way of the warrior. Bushido is actually a modern creation. The samurai didn't call their culture Bushido, or their code Bushido. Bushido is like, let's take the idea of the samurai and make it something that can be applied to everybody. We're going to take this idea of Bushido and cultural reference to the emperor and combine it with the technology, industrialization, transportation, and other ideas that they borrow from the West. And this, they do it in rapid order, because imagine this, in 1860, Japan is a feudalistic society, but they industrialize at a record rate. By 1905, Japan will be a world power. As you can see from this print right here, Japan is going to defeat a naval power. This naval power is the Russians. We'll talk about the Russo-Japanese War here in just a minute when we talk about imperialism. But they're going to take on and defeat one of the most powerful empires in the world. They're going to win. That shows you how fast they create their new national identity. So let's talk about how nationalism helps justify modern empire building. Because if we look at nationalism and the Great Game, the reason why I call it the Great Game is empire building is often referred to by European leaders in the 1800s as a giant chess game, as European leaders try and outmaneuver their rivals. And so nationalism fits into this, because nationalists want to have status. They want to be able to one-up their rivals. And how do they do this? Well, through imperial pomp and circumstance. And what do I mean by that? This idea of being able to show off national greatness through royal weddings. Why do you think that the British still have royal weddings that cost millions of dollars? It's a way of highlighting British culture and rallying the British people around the monarchy. They also want cultural landmarks. They want something that is literally a stamp saying this is German, this is French. Now these landmarks can take the form of things like national parks, government buildings, statues, but they have to be nationally recognized. They have to be recognized for their cultural significance. We also see nationalists wanting to promote their distinct national culture through food, through theater, through the arts. This is why governments will support, national arts and things like that. They'll also support public services. As I pointed out, Germany will be at the forefront of this through public education. And they'll make this argument. Our culture, our nation state is the greatest because we're able to give everybody an education. We're able to provide everybody with health care. Then there's another way to highlight national greatness, through military prowess. Now, in the late 1800s, what's been going on and coming to its zenith? The Industrial Revolution. So if you're going to highlight your military capabilities, you want to be able to highlight your most technologically advanced weapons, your most technologically advanced military items, if you will. And at the time, the most technologically advanced weapon system on the planet was the battleship. And so in the late 1800s, whoever had the most battleships they could claim that status of being the greatest nation state when it came to their militaries. And just like being able to sort of mark off how great you are by the number of ships you have, colonies. The more territory, the more yardage that you control on the globe showcases your national greatness. So nationalism, in its most extreme and perverse form, is going to justify European countries going out and basically oppressing other people in the world. But it's not just nationalism. So there are other reasons why imperialists want to build empires. And these can be sort of grouped into political and strategic motivations, securing resources, expanding trade, and then there's cultural attitudes. And we're going to go over these individually. So let's start. Let's look at political and strategic concerns. Well, the Industrial Revolution has created a massive underclass of poor, urban workers in Europe. And so many European leaders fear that this enormous, restless population could become radicalized. Revolutions are born out of hungry people. Just look at the sans-culottes of the French Revolution. So, establishing and maintaining colonies becomes a way to kind of release this excess population, to allow them a safety valve, a way to escape from their crowded, clustered, world in Europe. Now, there's some that are going to look at colonies as a way of just escaping their lives, whether they be poor working class, middle class, or even elites. Many Europeans are going to go to Asia and Africa, just wanting to put it bluntly, get away from it all. So some of the first people to actually explore, say, Africa here, are not people contracted by governments. They're going to be individual adventure seekers. One of the most popular is a fellow by the name of Dr. Livingstone. Now, Dr. Livingstone, or Dr. Livingston, his name's sometimes, for some reason, shortened to Dr. Livingston, will basically go to Africa in the 1850s and disappear off the face of the earth. Because right here, if I can get my mouse to work again, the centralmost part of Africa right here, if you looked at a map of it prior to the 1860s, there would just be this big blank space, because Europeans had no idea what was in there. It is men like Dr. Livingstone who will go out and explore Africa. They'll reach Lake Victoria and Victoria Falls, which is right here, and he'll reach that in 1855 and name it. He'll name it after Queen Victoria of Great Britain. And in the 1860s and 1870s, the English journalist Henry Stanley will seek out Dr. Livingstone. He keeps hearing about this white guy running around in Africa. And of course he finds him here around Lake Victoria in 1871. And of course, as the myth goes, he walks up to Dr. Livingstone and says, "Dr. Livingstone, I presume." Now, this is like walking into a room that you've never been in that has 200 people into it and being able to say to one person, "Dr. So-and-so, I presume." Well, of course, there's an easy way to explain why he was able to do this. Dr. Livingstone was the only white guy there. Now, it's not just the adventure seekers. It's not just the excess population. It's also some strategic concerns, because the Industrial Revolution has made the need for trade and access to resources that much more acute. To have access to the resources of the world, to have access to markets, European countries need trade routes. And at this time, ships can't sail all the way from Europe to Asia. They need to be, periodically fueled up. They need to have coal. They need to have fresh water. They need to have food. And so European powers are going to establish, let's use Africa here for example, they're going to establish ports all the way down the coast here. And these ports are going to be of national interest to these European powers because they're a lifeline. The problem for Europeans is some of these ports were originally founded back during the time of Columbus, back in the 15 and early 1600s. But back during the time of sail, all you needed was a port where you could dock ships and have friendly relations with the natives. However, the Industrial Revolution and the advent of steam-powered ships changes this. Because with steam-powered ships, you need to have coal, fuel. You need to have port facilities that can maintain highly complex machinery. You need to have a trained port staff. Excuse me, sorry. You need to have a trained port staff. So these ports grow exponentially. In order to feed these new workers, you have to bring in, you have to recruit, you have to give incentive for European farmers to move to Africa. And of course this increases tension with local native tribes. And of course that means you have to expand the boundaries of your colony in order to not only protect the port itself, but protect the people that support the port. And so this is why you can see these little bitty countries here along the coast. They're outgrowths of this. And then of course these larger colonies, some of them start out the same way. Now, not only do these ports allow you to support your own economy, these ports can not only support merchant ships, they can support warships. And thus, these ports act as military bases and allow whoever is strongest in the region to dominate the sea lanes here, to intimidate their European competitors. Because if you can cut off your European competitors, or you can just threaten to cut them off from raw materials and markets, you can showcase that you are stronger again, that you can force your influence upon your neighbors. Because at this time, resources and expanded trade are paramount. Because colonies will offer these European countries all the necessary raw materials that they need to continue the Industrial Revolution. Rubber, for example, from the Congo and Malaya, is needed as the Industrial Revolution transitions from steam to the industrial combustion engine. You need rubber for gas seals and tires and things like that. Tin and copper are important for, electrical wiring, for, head gaskets and things like that. Of course, when you transition to the internal combustion engine, you need oil. Now, oil, was already necessary as a lubricant, but now oil, coming from places like what is today Indonesia, back 100 years ago, it was known as the Dutch East Indies, because the country of the Netherlands is going to invade and take over Indonesia for its oil supply. That's why, if you guys have ever gotten gas at a Shell station, its real name is not Shell, it's Dutch Shell, because Shell gets its start, drilling for oil in what is today Indonesia. So having access, having control over these raw materials is very much important to Europeans. Now, there's some materials that, well, they're not necessary for the Industrial Revolution, but they have inherent value themselves. One reason why the British Empire is so powerful and wealthy is because they will control this. They'll control South Africa and the areas around it. Why is this important? Well, in the mid-1800s, farmers that originally arrived when South Africa was controlled by the Dutch, these are known as Boers, people of Dutch heritage, they will discover diamonds in South Africa. Well, they themselves will not take advantage of this. However, English entrepreneurs, most notably this man right here, this is Cecil Rhodes. Cecil Rhodes is often known as the Colossus of Rhodes, he is Europe's, or not Europe's, but Britain's foremost imperialist, Because as a young man, Cecil Rhodes immigrates to South Africa. He starts a business as a merchant and becomes fairly wealthy. And when diamonds are discovered, he uses his wealth to go into business with some other British businessmen to buy the land of these Dutch farmers, these Boer farmers, and to create a diamond mining company and diamond exchange. Now, for some reason, it doesn't become known as the Cecil Rhodes Diamond Exchange. Instead, they take the name of the family farm that they first buy, De Beers. So if you've ever bought a diamond, ladies, or gentlemen, if you're ever planning on buying a diamond, it comes through the De Beers Diamond Exchange, because the De Beers Diamond Exchange not only sells diamonds and is sort of the wholesale outlet for the De Beers Diamond Mining Company, which is still around mining diamonds in South Africa. De Beers in the 1800s will come to be the authority on diamonds. They'll set the standard. They will define what carat, clarity, and cut is. So if you are dealing in raw diamonds, you literally have to sell them to De Beers. So De Beers holds a monopoly on the diamond industry, and as a result, those countries associated with De Beers, like Great Britain and like Holland, are going to profit from the diamond trade. Now finally, on this slide, not only do European countries need raw materials for the Industrial Revolution, they need markets, because over time they run out of people to buy their stuff in Europe. There's only so many widgets you can sell people in Britain. However, if you control the colony, going back here, if you're a Briton and you control everything here in yellow, you can make it, you can set the regulations that give priority, if you will, to British-made goods. You can close out. You can either tax them to make them less appealing, or you can just bar them altogether. Goods made by your economic rivals, thus guaranteeing that you have markets that you can sell stuff at marked up prices. Now, there are also cultural attitudes that affect, the need for Europeans to, colonize the world, and it's sort of a strange marriage of European philanthropy and ethnocentrism, because on the one hand, you have Christian missionaries who view the colonies as a fertile ground for converts. These Christian missionaries like the fact that European powers are taking them over because it protects their missionary work. They're no longer running the risk of running afoul of local chiefs, local authorities, and being thrown out, or even worse, killed. And many Europeans, on the other side of the coin, feel that these people are, savages, that Europeans are bringing civilization to these people, and that in some ways, some of these imperialists believe that they don't even need to bring civilization to these people. They need to push them aside so that the land, the resources, can be made free for Europeans. Cecil Rhodes is one of these. He is famously quoted as saying, "We, the British, are the finest race in the world, and the more of the world we inhabit, the better it is for the human race." Basically what Rhodes is getting at is push these other people away. Just, push them off the table and make room for the British. Now, some imperialists, again, this is a British imperialist, take a different take on imperialism. Instead of viewing it as an opportunity to basically clear the way for European expansion, cultural expansion, making room for European farmers and individuals, Rudyard Kipling, who was a British imperialist, a well-known British imperialist, viewed the role and the duty of Europeans in a different way from his contemporary Cecil Rhodes. For Kipling, the Europeans had a duty to civilize these savage lands. And being a writer and poet, he put it put it to pen, and this is his famous poem, White Man's Burden. Let me read it to you. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go bind your sons to exile, to serve your captives' need. To wait in heavy harness on fluttered folk and wild, your new-caught sullen peoples, half devil and half child. Let's examine this. What is the white man's burden? It is to send your best, your sons, your daughters, to go and be in exile in the service of your captives. So he's recognizing that Europeans, British in particular, are taking over places. They are capturing whole cultures. But at the same time, the people doing this are British, are British citizens who are literally being put in the service of these captive peoples, because it is not the captive peoples that are waiting in heavy harness. It is the British colonizers that are waiting in heavy harness. And who are they waiting on? These savage peoples that are seen on the one hand as innocent and childlike, but at the other they're savage and devils. So let's look at colonialism or imperialism in practice. We've talked about the reasons behind imperialism, the origins of imperialism. Let's talk about it in practice. Now, let's look at China really quick, because China, I start out with China because China before the 1600s was the major power in Asia. The Qing dynasty was a powerful land power that dominated not only what is today modern China, but also Indochina, what is today Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia. They had influence over Thailand, and they actually had influence in territories that are now claimed by both Bangladesh and India. So, these Qing dynasty emperors were incredibly powerful. However, in the early to mid 1800s, the British start to penetrate China. And when I say the British, I mean British merchants, not the British military, the British merchants. And these British merchants are, of course, bringing manufactured goods to China. Now, these merchants, they want hard currency. They want gold and silver. Now, this isn't good for the Chinese economy, because this means that hard currency is flowing out of China and flowing to a foreign land. So this is one thing that the Chinese emperors don't like. The second thing that these merchants are doing is they're not only selling manufactured goods, they're selling drugs. They're selling opium. Because Britain at this time has control over what we call today Afghanistan. And so these Afghan farmers are growing poppies. The British merchants are refining it into opium, and then they're selling this opium to the Chinese people. And this opium trade is highly destructive on the Chinese society, and this is not lost upon Chinese leaders. So what does the Chinese emperors and the people that serve the Chinese emperors do? Well, in order to both keep the gold and silver at home and to keep the drugs out, the Chinese emperors pass a series of laws. One of these laws states that British merchants cannot deal directly with the Chinese population. Instead, they have to go through officials of the imperial court, known as cohogs. These cohogs will then sell at the wholesale level to Chinese merchants, who will then sell the British manufactured goods. Now, these cohogs don't work for the British merchants; they work for the court, the Chinese emperors. And so they're not going to deal in drugs, and drugs is a lucrative trade. So in the 1840s, Britain will fight a series of wars with China that becomes known as the Opium Wars. China loses badly. Not only do the British gain a permanent foothold, or at least until 1999, a permanent foothold off the coast of China in the form of Hong Kong, but they gain certain privileged rights. For example, gone are those laws that you have to have a special representative to sell your goods. British merchants will operate with impunity. If they break the law, they are not allowed to be tried in Chinese courts. They are tried in British courts. So they're effectively above Chinese law. And what this allows the British merchants to do is to deal in as much opium as they want, because all the Chinese authorities can do is crack down on the users. They make it a capital offense to use opium. So you use opium and get caught, you're going to get beheaded. But they can't touch the British merchants. However, the classic example of imperialism is in India, because the British or other Europeans don't take over China. They weaken China, but they do take over India. Now, if we looked at India before the age of imperialism, it is not a unified state. It's not a unified kingdom. Instead, India is a collection of small principalities, each ruled by their own prince called a Raj, R-A-J. Now, beginning in the 1600s and going into the 1700s, the British, in the form of not the government, but again a private organization known as the East India Tea Company, later known as the East India Trading Company, is going to make economic ties and economic arrangements with these individual Rajas. So what starts out as all Europeans, like the Spanish, the Portuguese, the French, and the British, staking a claim to India, the East India Tea Company is going to muscle out all of the other European powers so that by, let's see here, by the 1840s, 1850s, the East India Tea Company dominates the economy of India in all of these principalities. Now, as a private company, the East India Company will hire its own military. It will hire local Indians, and at this time India includes modern-day India, Nepal, Bangladesh, and modern-day Pakistan. They'll hire individual Indians to serve as sepoys. Sepoys are basically mercenaries, privately, hired contractors, if you will, that work for the East India Company. Now, in 1856 and 1857, the East India Tea Company will introduce new rifles and new ammunition. The new ammunition is made waterproof for the humid climate in India by dipping the cartridge in animal fat. Now, remember, these are muzzle-loading black powder muskets. So this is a paper cartridge that has powder, the ball, and you rip it open, you pour the powder down, and then you stuff it down, stuff the paper wadding in with the ball, and you ram it home with the ramrod. The problem in India is before the dipping of these things in animal fat, the paper would soak up moisture. Black powder would get damp, and it wouldn't work right. It wouldn't fire. So the East India Company comes up with this new kind of ammunition. The problem is they don't care what kind of animal fat that they use. They don't really know what kind of animal fat that they use. However, the Indians that serve as sepoys care a lot about what kind of animal fat it is. If they are Muslim sepoys, they don't want to stick and bite into pork fat. If they are Hindu sepoys, they don't want to do that with beef fat. And so in 1857, when the East India Company officials basically ordered them to use the new ammunition, they rebel. They mutiny. And so in order to protect their investment, the East India Tea Company was a valued component of the British economy. The British government was heavily invested in the East India Company. In order to protect their investment, the British government will send in military regulars. They'll send in redcoats to fight against the Sepoy Rebellion and put it down. And so in 1858, the government intervenes. They defeat the Sepoys, and they take over India. The Rajas are left in symbolic control, but the real power in India is a British government-appointed official who is sent from Great Britain, known as the Viceroy of India. And so from 1858 up until 1946, it is the viceroys of India who control India. Now, once the British start to take over India, they find some of the cultural aspects of India to be atrocious. One of them is the practice of sati. Sati is the practice of throwing the wife of a deceased husband on their ceremonial cremation fire. Because in Hindu culture, bodies are cremated and then shoved into the Ganges River. In traditional Hindu society, women are considered the property of first their fathers and then their husbands. And so when a person dies, their family is expected to literally throw their possessions, including their wife, onto the funeral fire, alive. Now the British, they find this completely disgusting. This is abhorrent to them, so they ban the practice of sati. And there are several other cultural practices that the British try to ban, some to greater success than others. Now, the interesting thing about imperialism is that once you have an established colony, that colony justifies further imperialism. Because after the British establish India, they start to have problems along the border of this new colony with Burma. So that by the 1880s, the British just send military forces into Burma and take it over. They take over Burma in order to secure, the Indian colony. Likewise, in the 1820s and 1830s, where's my pointer here? Come on, where's the pointer? There it is. In the 1820s and 1830s, the British will establish a major naval base for merchant and military ships here at Singapore. In order to defend and protect Singapore, they're going to expand first onto the large island that Singapore is on, and then they're going to invade Malaysia. They will call it British Malaya, but today it's called Malaysia. And so that they're going to move into Malaysia because the people of Malaysia, the elites of Malaysia, are hostile to British possession of Singapore. So they're not going to put up with the threat to this major naval base. They're just going to secure it by expanding the colony. The poster child for European colonization is not Asia, however. It's Africa. And as we mentioned before, the first people to really travel to Africa are not European governments or anybody connected with European governments. It's people seeking an escape from Europe or seeking adventure, like Dr. Livingstone. Before 1875, there's only limited colonization, mostly along the coast right here. As I said, most of this right in here was unknown to Europeans. Africa was known as the Dark Continent, not because the people being dark, but because Europeans had no knowledge of Africa. However, with the discovery of resources, with the discovery of tin and copper, oil, and various other valuable items, Europeans are going to start to move in. They're going to start to divide up and conquer the peoples of Africa. The problem is as Europeans start dividing Africa up, they start bumping into each other. And there's questions over where the borders are between, say, the French colonies here and, say, the Belgian Congo, or the borders between this is Anglo-Egyptian Sudan, that's a British colony, and the Congo, or here between the French and the British. So in let me see if I got the dates right on this. Oops, wrong direction. In 1884 and 1885, the German leader Kaiser Wilhelm I is going to call the Berlin Conference. What this conference is all of the European powers, Britain, France, Portugal, Belgium, Germany, they're all going to be called together. And they're going to basically lay out a map of Africa and divide it up. They're going to just say, this is mine, okay, you can have that, they can have that, but that right there is mine. And they're going to draw the boundaries to these colonies. Now the reason why they want to draw these boundaries is to avoid colonial conflict. Because the fear is that a colonial conflict over borders could expand fairly quickly into a broader conflict, drawing in European armies not only fighting here in the colonies, but fighting in Europe. And at least in the 1880s, that's one of the things that the Europeans are going to want to avoid. As we're going to see later on in class, in about 30 years, they're going to want to fight. And they're going to happily go to war. And of course, they're going to happily go to war for World War I. Now, what's the significance of this Berlin Conference? No Africans were consulted. All of these decisions about who gets what was determined by the Europeans. So, not only are the Europeans taking control of these colonies, in some cases brutally, the Belgians treat the Congolese people horribly, but sometimes they will divide people of ethnic or national origin. Like, for example, I believe it's between here and here, you have tribes that are, one's in this green colony and one's in the red colony. Or you have the cases where you have two groups that hate each other, like here in Nigeria, put into the same colony. In the south of Nigeria, even today, you have the Igbo people. The Igbo people are right now mainly Christian because of the British influence. However, the people of northern Nigeria are of a different tribe and a different religion. They're predominantly Muslims. And so you have intermittent religious and tribal war breaking out in Nigeria even today because of these, these hatreds of being forced to basically be in the same country. So many of the problems of Africa, while they have their roots in the traditional African tribal conflicts, they're made worse by European imperialism. Now, America will also try its hand at the imperial game. However, America is a relatively latecomer. One reason why the United States is a latecomer to the imperial game is because, well, to put it bluntly, we had our hands full. Between 1860 and 1890, the United States was first fighting a civil war, and then we were too busy filling up the interior of our country. We're too busy colonizing, if you want to use that term, what is the American continent, the continental United States. However, the American frontier is going to officially close in 1890, and many Americans are going to look beyond our shores for expansion. Now, let's look at American policies and how they work into, America's sort of imperial mindset. Because America has not been just sort of isolating itself from the world before, this time period. America has been, interacting with the world. Now, the roots of American influence in the Western Hemisphere are laid as early as the 1820s. Because in the 1820s, going into the 1830s, many of the modern countries of Latin America are going to throw off the shackles of European control, namely Spanish control. While they're doing this, there's a real danger that, these new countries are going to be relatively weak. They're going to basically throw off the influence and control of one European power and maybe have to be taken over by another European power. Fearing this, the American president, James Monroe, issues what is known as the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. This is basically an ultimatum sent to the European powers, stating that the United States will not allow any new colonies to be founded in the Western Hemisphere. So if a country is able to gain its freedom from European control, the United States will not allow that country to be taken over by either the old master or a new master. Now, while this Monroe Doctrine doesn't say that the United States will take any action in the Western Hemisphere, it does set the precedent that the United States is going to act as the big brother, the protector of these other countries in the Western Hemisphere. And later American presidents are going to use the Monroe Doctrine as a justification for American action in Latin America, most notably Teddy Roosevelt. Now, Teddy Roosevelt will use the Monroe Doctrine as a justification for action in Panama. In 1903, Panama, the Panamanian people, are struggling against their own form of empire, because Panama is not an independent country in 1903. Instead, it is part of Colombia. And the Colombians, of course, are, the Panamanians see them as a foreign power. And so that they're rebelling, trying to gain their own nation state. Now, Roosevelt is going to send the American Navy to, in his words, isolate the rebellion. But what Roosevelt really is doing is he's keeping the Colombians from sending reinforcements to their forces in Panama. This allows the Panamanians to get the upper hand and win, and Panama is born. What the Panamanians give the United States government in exchange for their help is the right to build the Panama Canal. So from 1904 to 1913, the United States will build one of the modern wonders of the world, the Panama Canal, because we gain the right to do that by helping the Panamanians gain their freedom. Now, how does Roosevelt justify this internationally, but also to his critics here at home? Well, Roosevelt says that under the Monroe Doctrine, the United States not only has the right to protect Latin America from outside powers, the United States has the right to interfere because we are the big brother. This is often called the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Now, while America is not building a colony in Panama, the effect of what the Monroe Doctrine addresses, which is a dying Spanish empire, will be what initiates America's experiment with imperialism. Because once Spain loses, Mexico loses Latin America and South America, their only holdings in the world are small little bits and pieces, like, for example, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and the Philippines. And the Spanish are not blind to the fact that colonies and military power determine how powerful a country is, and they don't want to be the weak power in Europe, so that they're going to desperately hang on to their colonies and use brutal force to do it. Well, the fact that the Spanish are using brutal tactics to suppress the Cuban people, for example, is going to give the imperialist in this country, in the United States, a justification for going to war. Because American imperialists like Joseph Pulitzer and William Randolph Hearst, two major newspaper publishers in this country, are going to, in their newspapers, they're going to argue and voice the opinion that America could be a better caretaker to these small and vulnerable peoples like the Cubans and the Filipinos than the Spanish are. And so Pulitzer and Hearst are going to use their influence to push the American public opinion toward wanting to get involved in Cuba. Well, in 1898, the American president, William McKinley, responding to increasing public pressure to do something about what's going on in Cuba, sends an American battleship, the Maine, to show the flag and kind of intimidate the Spanish authorities. Well, the night that the Maine gets there, it blows up. Now, we now know that more than likely the Maine blew up because of an accidental fire that got into its powder magazines. However, back then, Hearst and Pulitzer, their newspapers, reported that it was Spanish sabotage. And because of these reports, the United States Congress declares war on Spain, and we go to war. This is the Spanish-American War of 1898-1899. This is a fairly short war, but what comes out of it is an American territorial empire, because the United States will gain the territories of the Philippines, Guam, will be able to protect Cuba. Cuba will not become a territory of the United States, but instead the United States will declare the right to protect Cuba. Cuba will become what is known as a protectorate of the United States. And the United States will declare the Philippines to be an American territory. Now, why doesn't America continue to build its empire? Why does Americans in general pull away from imperialism? Well, it's because of what happens after the Spanish-American War. Because between 1899 and 1901, the United States is going to have to fight an insurrection of the Filipinos. Now, these Filipinos had been fighting against the Spanish before 1898. They had fought alongside American troops against the Spanish. But when the American troops did not leave, the Filipino insurrectionists turned against the Americans. And so this bloody war in the Philippines makes it back to the American public. And the American public simply says, wait a minute, this is not us. The American public says that we are not an imperial power. We are the product of a rebellion against an empire. In 1776, we rebelled against the British Empire. And so this fervor for imperialism wanes. It diminishes in this country. And so America's experiment in territorial empire is going to basically, decline. America will remain more of an economic empire, dominating the world through, our manufacturing and control of international commerce, not by going and taking over territory the same way that Europeans are. But it's not just the Europeans that are practicing imperialism. Japan is going to become an imperial power as well. Because by the 1890s, Japan has a modern navy. Japan is extending its influence in the Pacific region and onto the Pacific mainland. This puts them in direct conflict with the weakened Empire of China. And they will fight China in the Sino-Japanese War of 1894. They'll beat the Chinese and become the predominant power in Asia. What they get out of this is they get the peninsula of Korea, which will be a colony of Japan until 1945, and they also gain influence in northern China, what is called Manchuria. Now, this acquisition of influence in Manchuria puts them on a collision course with another power who's trying to gain influence in Manchuria. This is the Russians. And so the Russians and the Japanese are going to fight a short war in 1904 and 1905. The Japanese kicked the Russians' butt. And so at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, Japan is going to be recognized not just as a regional power, but as a world power. Now, this recognition of Japan as a world power is going to lead to, well, future problems, because now Japan has a free hand in Asia. The only thing limiting Japan's expansion in the Pacific are the European powers that control places like French Indochina, British Malaya, the Dutch East Indies, and the American colony of the Philippines. So America, in gaining the Philippines after the Spanish-American War, and the Japanese after their defeat of the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, are going to be put on a collision course with each other that ultimately leads to World War II. So what are the effects of imperialist expansion? Well, let's look at the negatives. You have disruption of native cultures, because you have these native cultures oppressed. You have their cultures, damaged, because now they are prisoners in their own land. You see environmental destruction. In the Belgian Congo, for example, the Belgian government will come in and force these Congolese farmers off their land, disrupt their societies, and force them to mine, open pit mining. So you see environmental destruction in that way. You see colonial tensions, as we talked about with the Berlin Conference. You also see something that's called blowback. Blowback is where what's going on in the mother country is affected by imperialist policies abroad. Let's look at Britain in particular. Because Britain prided itself as being a liberal, free society. But if a British citizen stood up and voiced an opinion against the British Empire, they may lose their job. They may be ostracized. They may lose their freedom. They are being affected by these imperialist policies the same way as the oppressed peoples are. Maybe not to the same degree, but they're still being affected. That is blowback. And then, of course, as we're going to see, the biggest blowback is a European-wide war. Now, there are some positives, because in an ironic twist, the very imperialism that oppresses people in Africa and Asia is going to give them the ideas, the Western ideas of liberty. The Enlightenment is going to be spread by imperialism. Technology is also going to be spread, because as these imperial powers take over Africa and Asia, like in India, for example, they're going to introduce railroads. They're going to introduce modern science. They're going to introduce modern manufactured goods. They're going to introduce modern communications like the telegraph. And of course, these are all going to be beneficial later on. They also introduce a global consciousness. In many parts of the world, like in the center of Africa, many of the peoples that lived there had no idea about the world more than 100 miles around them. They only knew the next tribe. They did not know that what happened thousands of miles away had a direct impact upon their lives. And then many of these European imperial powers introduce their educational systems. And of course, this too, like the spread of Western ideas, is going to be a fatal, stake in the heart of imperialism. Because think about this. The British introduced British-style education to India. Smart Indian students will gain access to some of the best schools in Great Britain itself, like Oxford. Gandhi, the man who will lead India to independence, is trained as a British lawyer. He goes to Oxford. Hell, I would kill to be able to go to Oxford. But Gandhi, Mahatma Gandhi, goes to Oxford, so he understands British culture. He understands the elite, because that's where the elite send their kids. And he understands English law. And he uses his understanding of this to facilitate India's freedom using non-violent methods. We'll talk about Gandhi a little bit later on. Okay.